They called him Il Divino, the divine, Michelangelo Buonarroti, the sculptor who perceived not merely stone, but angels imprisoned within the cold marble, wielding his chisel not to carve, but to liberate them. The solitary painter who manifested the heavens above the papal throne. The architect who raised the dome that would rise as the enduring symbol of Western civilization. Yet, who was the man beneath the myth? This eternally sullen, solitary, and obsessed titan, whose existence was an exhausting, interminable battle. This is the chronicle of his ascent. It traces the path of a son born to a faded, aristocratic line that looked upon art with disdain, rising to become the supreme creator of his age. It is a tale of tortuous collisions with the most powerful men on earth, of a bitter rivalry with the golden genius of Raphael, and of a tragic, eternal dissatisfaction with his own soul. Here lies the narrative of masterpieces that defied the limits of mortality, of 4 agonizing years spent suspended beneath the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, of the colossal block of rejected stone transformed into the perfection of David, and of a twilight spent in near blindness, still laboring under the conviction that art is a jealous god demanding the whole of a man. This is not merely the portrait of a genius. It is a testament to suffering, to obsession, and to the superhuman will capable of transmuting lifeless stone into an eternal miracle. The story of Michelangelo Buonarroti begins on March 6, 1475, in the quiet village of Caprese near Florence. He was born into the fading twilight of an ancient Florentine lineage, a family rich in pride, yet destitute in coin. His father, Ludovico, held the temporary and modest office of podesta, a local administrator. To the Buonarroti clan, their status as citizens of Florence was a badge of honor, yet their financial reality was dire. To a man like Ludovico, the notion that his son might lower himself to manual labor was unthinkable. In their world, the only dignified paths for nobility were the sword, the church, or the state. Art, painting and sculpture, was deemed a trade for commoners, a dirty occupation, no nobler than that of a cobbler or a mason. Fate, however, had inscribed a different design. Shortly after his birth, Michelangelo's mother fell gravely ill. The infant was sent to the hills of Settignano, entrusted to the care of a wet nurse. This was no ordinary village. It was the heart of the great stone quarries. The woman who nursed him was the wife of a stonecutter. From his earliest breaths, Michelangelo was not cradled by silence or the scent of wildflowers, but by the dust of pulverized rock. His lullabies were not gentle songs, but the rhythmic percussion of iron striking stone. Decades later, as an old man, he would remark with a sharp irony, "With my nurse's milk I sucked in the hammer and chisels I use for my statues." When the boy returned to his family, his father attempted to break his spirit, forcing him into the study of grammar and Latin. But the young Michelangelo had no appetite for books. He spent every stolen moment drawing, copying icons from churches and the frescoes of old masters like Giotto and Masaccio. His talent was undeniable, yet to his father it was a source of profound shame. History records the beatings inflicted by his father and uncles, brutal attempts to pound this unworthy passion out of him. But the obstinacy that would define his legend had already taken root. At the age of 13, defying his bloodline, Michelangelo won his first war. He entered the most prestigious workshop in Florence, the Bottega of Domenico Ghirlandaio. This workshop was a factory of aesthetics, churning out frescoes for the great churches and palaces of the city. Here, Michelangelo began at the bottom, grinding colors, mixing plaster, but his ascent was meteoric. Legend holds that within a year, the pupil had eclipsed the teacher. One day, seeing a drawing by another apprentice, Michelangelo seized a pen and corrected it with such terrifying confidence and force that Ghirlandaio, upon seeing the result, famously exclaimed, "This boy knows more than I do." But the true turning point, the stroke of fortune that would alter the course of art history, came from the highest echelons of power. The young apprentice caught the eye of Lorenzo de' Medici, known to history as Il Magnifico. Lorenzo was not merely the ruler of Florence. He was a poet, a philosopher, and the architect of the most brilliant cultural court in Europe. Dreaming of reviving the lost glory of sculpture, Lorenzo had gathered a collection of ancient Roman and Greek statues in the gardens of San Marco, establishing a sanctuary for young talent. He invited Michelangelo to join them. For a boy raised to believe art was a disgrace, this was an entry into a new reality. He left the dusty workshop and moved into the Medici palace itself. He was no longer a simple student. He became a ward of the dynasty. He broke bread at the same table as Lorenzo's children, two of whom would become future popes. He absorbed the Neoplatonic wisdom of the age's greatest philosophers, Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola. In the Medici gardens, studying the ancients, he sought to unlock the secrets of their harmony and power. It was here that Michelangelo the sculptor was truly born.
His early works from this period, the Madonna of the Stairs and the Battle of the Centaurs, were not the tentative efforts of a novice, but the statements of a master. He did not simply copy antiquity, he challenged it. Lorenzo adored him, seeing in his hands the future of Florentine art. But in 1492, Lorenzo died. The golden age of Florence was extinguished. Power fell to the fanatic monk Girolamo Savonarola, who preached asceticism and lit the bonfire of the vanities, burning books and art in the city squares. Deprived of his protector, Michelangelo fled, first to Venice, then to Bologna. It was the beginning of a life of wandering. Yet, he knew he had to prove his genius to the world. And so, he turned his gaze toward the place where art, power, and history converge. He set out for the eternal city. He went to Rome. Upon arriving in Rome in 1496, Michelangelo was 21 years old and burning with ambition. He sought a commission that would not merely employ him, but announce him to history. It arrived swiftly. Cardinal Jean de Bilher, a diplomat of the French court, required a monument for his future tomb in St. Peter's Basilica. The subject was the Pietà, the lamentation of the Virgin Mary over the fallen body of Christ. Michelangelo attacked the task with a holy obsession. He journeyed personally to the white scars of the Carrara Mountains, living among the quarrymen for months, searching for the immaculate vessel. He demanded a block of marble without a single vein of imperfection. When he returned to Rome, the chisel began to move, and it became evident that the world was witnessing a new alchemy. In 2 years, he forged a work of such terrifying harmony that it remains the apex of technical perfection. This Pietà defied all tradition. Where others carved agony and crude sorrow, Michelangelo carved a divine, ethereal silence. The body of Christ, lifeless yet anatomically flawless, rests in the lap of a Mary who is impossibly young. Her face bears no desperation, only a serene, luminous acceptance. When critics questioned her youth, the sculptor replied that purity preserves the bloom of eternity. The stone was polished to such a mirror-bright luster that it seemed not carved by iron tools, but breathed into existence. It was here that his pride briefly pierced his divinity. Upon overhearing pilgrims attribute the work to another master, Michelangelo slipped into the basilica under the cover of night. In a fit of jealous fury, he struck his hammer against the Madonna's sash, carving the only signature he would ever leave. Michelangelo Buonarroti, Florentine, made this. His fame swept across Italy like a fever. He was no longer a prodigy, he was a master. In 1501, Florence called her son home. The city had changed. The tyranny of Savonarola had turned to ash. The Republic was restored, and the new government sought a symbol of their reborn liberty. They possessed a unique, cursed object. For 40 years, a colossal block of Carrara marble, 5 meters high, had lain abandoned in the cathedral yard. Known as the Giant, it had been butchered by previous sculptors who had gouged it and fled in failure. It was considered dead stone, a wasted ruin. They offered the impossible to the 26-year-old Michelangelo, to extract a masterpiece from this scarred refuse. He accepted with a predator's hunger. To him, this was not a job. It was a war against damaged matter. He labored in total isolation for nearly 3 years, hidden behind a wooden enclosure. It was a titanic physical siege. He worked with only a hammer and chisel, peeling away the layers of failure. And once again, he shattered tradition. David had always been depicted after the victory, standing triumphant over the severed head of Goliath. Michelangelo chose a different moment. He chose the breath before the strike. His David is not a boy, but a powerful athlete, a vessel of coiled tension. He is not yet a hero. He is becoming one. His muscles are taut, his brow furrowed in terrible concentration, what contemporaries called terribilità. He stares into the distance at an invisible enemy, armed only with a sling and a terrifying will. When the wooden barriers came down, Florence stood paralyzed in reverence. This was not merely a biblical figure. It was the avatar of the Republic itself, young, defiant, and ready to face any Goliath, be it the Medici tyrants or foreign armies. A committee, including Leonardo da Vinci, decided that such power could not be hidden on a cathedral roof. They placed it in the heart of the city, at the Piazza della Signoria. David became a political totem of civic courage. With this stroke, Michelangelo ascended. He was no longer simply the greatest sculptor in Italy. He was the titan who could breathe life into dead stone. But fame is a dangerous signal. It reached the ears of the most ambitious man on earth, Pope Julius II, who decided that only this Florentine genius was worthy to build his tomb. The marble giant had been conquered. Now, the Vatican awaited. The echo of the David resonated across Italy, finally reaching the ears of the most ambitious and impatient man in Christendom, Pope Julius II. Julius was no mere shepherd of souls. He was the warrior pope, a man of indomitable energy who led his own armies into battle to expand the papal states. He dreamed of restoring Rome not just as a spiritual center, but as an imperial capital, rivaling the glory of the Caesars. To manifest this vision, he needed titans equal to his own ego. In 1505, the summons was issued. Michelangelo, now 30, was called to the Vatican. The commission was worthy of them both. The Pope did not want a simple sepulchre. He demanded a mausoleum to rival the pharaohs, a monument of eternal power. It was to be a freestanding architectural universe, 3 stories high, adorned with 40 life-sized statues. Victories and bound captives at the base, prophets and sibyls ascending the tiers, and at the summit, Julius himself, lifted toward heaven by angels. Michelangelo, whose soul craved the impossible, was intoxicated. He saw the chance to unleash his wildest sculptural fantasies. He retreated to the source, the white peaks of Carrara.
For 8 agonizing, ecstatic months, he lived among the quarrymen. He did not simply order the stone, he hunted it. Climbing the precipices, hammer in hand, he struck the rock, listening to its voice, searching for hidden fissures. In the silence of the mountain, he looked into the raw blocks and saw the ghosts of future prophets and dying slaves waiting to be born. When the ships arrived in Rome, hundreds of tons of marble flooded the piazza before St. Peter's. It was a mountain moved by sheer will. Michelangelo began to hire assistants, his mind feverish with inspiration. And then, the winds of the Vatican shifted. Julius II, a man of violent enthusiasms, suddenly grew cold. The funding stopped. The reasons remain shrouded in history.
Perhaps it was the whisper of Donato Bramante, the Pope's architect and Michelangelo's envious rival, warning that building a tomb during one's lifetime was an omen of death. Or perhaps the Pope's hunger had simply moved to a new feast, the demolition of the ancient St. Peter's Basilica to build the greatest temple on earth. The marble lay abandoned in the square. Michelangelo, having spent his own fortune on the logistics, sought an audience. He was refused. Day after day, the doors of the Vatican remained barred. Humiliated, enraged, and unpaid, the proud Florentine did the unthinkable. He deserted. Under the cloak of night, like a thief, he fled Rome on horseback, riding hard for Florence. He knew the wrath of the Vicar of Christ could cost him his life. Julius roared. How dared a simple craftsman defy the Pope? Couriers were dispatched with threats, then pleas. He demanded the Florentine government surrender the fugitive, but Michelangelo refused. A war of nerves ensued between the two most obstinate men in Italy. Finally, under the threat of excommunication and war against Florence, the artist yielded. The reunion took place not in Rome, but in the conquered city of Bologna. Michelangelo arrived, in his own words, with a rope around his neck. He knelt before the throne, expecting execution. But Julius, staring down at the trembling genius, saw a reflection of his own fire. Instead of a death sentence, he offered a rebuke that sounded like a compliment. Instead of coming to us, you have made us come to you. He was forgiven, but the tomb, the tragedy of his life, was silenced. Instead, likely at the venomous suggestion of Bramante, who sought to see him fail, Julius offered a new commission. It was a task that seemed a trap, a mockery for a man who claimed to despise painting. A commission that would rewrite the history of art. Michelangelo returned to Rome, the sting of his humiliation in Bologna still fresh. He expected to resume the great work of his life, the marble tomb that would rival the wonders of the ancient world. But the marble blocks lay silent in the piazza, gathering dust. Pope Julius had a new command, a command that felt less like an honor and more like a punishment. He led the artist into the Sistine Chapel. It was the fortress-like heart of the Vatican, the sanctuary where cardinals elected the vicars of Christ. The walls breathed with the frescoes of old masters, Botticelli, Perugino, but the cavernous ceiling, spanning 600 square meters, was a void. It was painted a simple, flat blue, dotted with gold stars. To a man of Julius's imperial ambition, such modesty was intolerable. He pointed a finger at the vault and ordered Michelangelo to paint it. The artist recoiled. He protested. He shouted, "Holy Father, this is not my trade. I am a sculptor, not a painter." He did not lie. Fresco, painting onto wet, drying plaster, is an unforgiving art. It demands speed and a chemistry of color that changes as the wall hardens. Michelangelo, whose soul was tuned to the slow, subtractive rhythm of the chisel, felt utterly unarmed for such a battle.
He saw the shadow of a conspiracy. He was convinced this was the work of Donato Bramante, the court architect. The trap was elegant and cruel. Force the sculptor onto the scaffolding, watch him fail, and let the disgrace clear the path for the young golden prodigy, Raphael. But the will of the warrior pope was as unyielding as the Carrara stone. Refusal was treason. With a heavy heart and a spirit consumed by despair, Michelangelo signed the contract in May of 1508. He entered a 4-year purgatory that would forge his immortality. At first, he attempted to work traditionally, hiring experienced fresco masters from Florence, but his absolute perfectionism could not abide their touch. He saw flaws in every line, errors in every shade.
In a fit of rage, he destroyed their work, fired every assistant, and bolted the doors. He would face the 600 square meters alone. He constructed his own scaffolding, a marvel of engineering that allowed him to stand and often lie inches from the ceiling. There, suspended 20 meters above the floor, he severed his connection to the world below. The physical toll was inhuman. For days, weeks, and months, he worked with his head thrown back, his spine bent into a bow of agony. Paint and caustic lime dripped constantly onto his face, blinding his eyes and burning his skin. He ate stale bread on the scaffold. He slept in his clothes. He documented his ruin with bitter irony in a poem, sketching a caricature of himself as a grotesque creature. My beard turns up to heaven, my chest like a harpy's, my loins into my paunch like a counterweight. This was not art. It was a daily, grinding exorcism. Yet in this misery, he engaged in a furious dialogue with God. He rejected the Pope's modest plan for the 12 apostles with disdain. Instead, he unleashed a theological storm. He chose the Genesis, the history of the world before the law. Inch by inch, the empty blue sky was colonized by a race of titans. From the separation of light from darkness to the great flood, he filled the void with hundreds of muscular, twisting figures. These were not painted men. They were statues forced into 2 dimensions. They possessed volume, weight, and a terrifying kinetic energy. And at the center of this painted universe, he placed the defining image of the Renaissance, the creation of Adam. It is not merely a biblical scene, it is a hymn to the divine spark. God the Father, a powerful elder born on a whirlwind of angels, reaches across the primordial void. Adam, magnificent in his lethargy, extends a hand in return. Their fingers do not touch. In that agonizing millimeter of empty space between them lies the entire mystery of existence. The tension before the current of life strikes the clay. Below, the Pope grew impatient. Julius would climb the ladders, striking the wood with his cane, shouting, "When will it be finished?" And the artist, his face masked in plaster, would hiss back, "When I can." Finally, on All Saints' Day in 1512, the scaffolding came down. Rome stood paralyzed. The chapel was no longer a room, it was a revelation. It was a universe of tragic beauty and blinding power. Michelangelo, now 37, descended from the heights. He was nearly blind, his body broken by arthritis, looking like an old man. But he had won. He had proven to his enemies and to history that the chisel and the brush were one in his hands. He had created the lexicon of Western art for centuries to come. With the ceiling complete, he turned his gaze back to his first love, the interrupted tragedy of his life, the tomb of Julius. But fate, as always, had not finished with him. After 4 years of painted purgatory, Michelangelo descended from the Sistine scaffold, exhausted,
but crowned with glory. He sought to return to his first love, the tragedy of the tomb of Pope Julius II. But the world had shifted beneath his feet. The Pope was dying. The grand pharaonic mausoleum was no longer a priority. The project was butchered, reduced from a freestanding universe to a modest wall monument. Yet, even in this diminished form, Michelangelo carved the Moses, a figure of such furious, contained energy that it seems ready to spring from the stone and shatter the tablets of the law. In 1513, power passed to Giovanni de' Medici, who took the name Leo X. He was the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, Michelangelo's childhood patron. It seemed a golden age had dawned. But Leo was a man of soft pleasures, not stone. He preferred the smooth charm of Raphael to the sullen genius of Michelangelo. Instead of glory in Rome, the Pope exiled the artist back to Florence. He tasked him with a project that would become another monument to futility, the marble facade of the Basilica of San Lorenzo. Once again, Michelangelo vanished into the mountains of Carrara. He built roads, engineered transport for Leviathan blocks, and fought the stone for years. But the Medici purse snapped shut. The project was canceled. To this day, the facade of San Lorenzo remains rough, naked brick, a silent scar testifying to the capriciousness of princes. Yet, from this rejection rose a masterpiece of sorrow, the Medici Chapel. In this cold, echoing space, Michelangelo carved a philosophical treatise on time and death. Upon the sarcophagi lie the allegories, dawn and dusk, day and night. These are not ideal beauties. They are heavy with the burden of existence. Dawn wakes in pain. Day is a muscular giant whose face remains unfinished, emerging from chaos. Night is a powerful woman lost in the oblivion of sleep. When a poet praised the realism of night, saying she seemed ready to speak, Michelangelo replied in verse, voicing the stone's own despair. Dear to me is sleep, and dearer still to be stone. To not see, to not feel, is my great fortune. But history would not let him sleep. In 1527, Florence rebelled against the Medici. Michelangelo, choosing duty over patronage, became the city's fortifications engineer. He designed revolutionary bastions to repel the papal armies. But the Republic fell. Hunted as a traitor, the artist hid in a secret underground room for months, sketching on the walls by candlelight. He was spared by the new Medici Pope, Clement VII, only because his genius was too valuable to destroy. But the pardon was a leash. He was ordered back to work on the tombs of the very family he had fought. In 1534, at the age of nearly 60, tired of betrayals, Michelangelo left Florence forever. He returned to Rome, believing his great works were behind him. He was wrong. A new pope demanded a final act. He pointed to the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel, directly beneath the ceiling painted a quarter-century prior. The subject was the Last Judgment. The man who climbed the scaffold was no longer the furious youth of the ceiling. He was an elder, scarred by war and the collapse of his ideals. He painted not creation, but the end of all things. The Last Judgment was a shockwave. It is a chaotic, terrifying vortex of naked bodies rising to salvation or plummeting to the abyss. At the center stands Christ, not a merciful shepherd, but a beardless Apollonian judge, raising his hand to damn the wicked. There is no hope here, only the terror of the absolute. The pious were scandalized. They called it a bathhouse of heresy. Biagio da Cesena, the papal master of ceremonies, sneered that such nudity belonged in a tavern, not a chapel. Michelangelo's revenge was eternal. He painted Sistine in the depths of hell as Minos, judge of the underworld, with donkey ears and a serpent biting his genitals. When Sistine begged the Pope to have it removed, the pontiff reportedly smiled and said, "If he had put you in purgatory, I could have prayed for you. But in hell, there is no redemption." Though later censors would paint veils over the nudity, the power of the work remained undimmed. Michelangelo had begun with the divine harmony of the Pietà. He ended with the apocalyptic despair of the Judgment. He had seen the beginning and the end. And now, in the twilight of his life, he would turn his hand to one final, impossible task. After the terrifying thunder of the Last Judgment, Michelangelo, now past 60, stood at a precipice. He was wealthy, world-renowned, worshipped as Il Divino. He could have faded into a twilight of honored rest, accepting small commissions for the elite of Europe. But his spirit, indomitable, titanic, restless, knew no peace. Fate had reserved one final test, the longest, heaviest, and most responsible burden of his life was yet to be shouldered. In 1546, Antonio da Sangallo, the chief architect of St. Peter's Basilica, died. The project was not merely a building. It was the stone heart of the Catholic Church. Yet for 40 years it had been a catastrophe. Begun under his old patron and nemesis, Julius II, the construction had crawled through decades of bureaucratic chaos, changing hands from Bramante to Raphael, stalling with every death of a pope. It was a ruin of unfulfilled ambition. Pope Paul III, desperate to salvage the enterprise, turned to the only authority left in Rome. He summoned Michelangelo. The artist was 72 years old. To the men of his time, he was ancient. At first, he refused. "I am a sculptor, not an architect," he insisted. "I am too old." But the Pope would not be denied. Michelangelo accepted, perhaps sensing a providential calling, a final labor for God. But he set a condition that stunned the Vatican. He refused a salary. He would work for no gold, only for the glory of St. Peter and the salvation of his own soul. It was a masterstroke of the old strategist. By rejecting money, he bought absolute freedom. He insulated himself from the accusations of greed and the petty intrigues of the Vatican clerks who had leeched off the project for decades. Upon seizing command, he acted with terrifying clarity. He reviewed the plans of his predecessor, Sangallo, and discarded them with contempt. He publicly savaged the design as a dark, Gothic forest, lacking light, full of hiding places for bandits and coin forgers. Instead, he reached back to the original, pure vision of his old rival, Donato Bramante. He returned to the Greek cross, a temple of central symmetry, but he purified it. He stripped away the excess. His vision was one of massive cohesion, the purity of form, the power of mass, the harmony of proportion. He envisioned a dome that would float in the air, surpassing the elegance of the Pantheon and the engineering audacity of Brunelleschi's Florence Cathedral. Thus began the final war of his life. Not against rebellious marble, but against time, inertia, and the decay of his own body. He worked with an obsession that frightened those around him. Every day, despite the agony of failing kidneys and arthritic joints, the old man rode his horse to the construction site. He climbed the scaffolds, inspecting every brick, shouting at foremen, carving wooden models to communicate his vision. His enemies did not sleep. Displaced architects and bitter officials sent endless letters to the Pope, accusing Michelangelo of senility, claiming his walls would collapse. But the pontiffs stood by him. They knew he was the only titan left. His crowning achievement, the labor of his final 17 years, was the dome. It was a miracle of engineering. To support the crushing weight of the stone heavens, he designed a double shell, an inner skin for decoration, an outer shell for protection, bound by a complex system of ribs. He designed the drum to be flooded with light, ensuring that the interior would feel not like a tomb, but like a celestial space. He would work on it until his final breath, yet he would never see it finished. It was completed after his death by his disciples, Giacomo della Porta and Domenico Fontana, who remained faithful to his blueprints. Today, when we stand in the square of Rome and look up at that Leviathan silhouette floating over the eternal city, we do not just see a symbol of the Vatican.
We see the final testament of Michelangelo. In sculpture, he expressed the rebellion and power of the body. In painting, he captured the terror and drama of the soul. But here, in the architecture of St. Peter's, at the end of his long and tortuous road, he finally found peace. He found the divine, mathematical harmony he had so desperately lacked in his own life. The dome became his final and most perfect slave, liberated not from stone, but from gravity itself, suspended in pure light. The final years of Michelangelo were like the slow, majestic extinction of a volcano. He was no longer merely a man. He was a living legend, a monument to himself. Behind his back, they whispered his name with a mixture of fear and reverence. Il Divino, the Divine One. He lived in a modest house near the Forum of Trajan, existing in a state of monastic asceticism. He slept little, often lying down in his clothes and boots, terrified of wasting a single moment that could be given to creation. He subsisted on bread and wine, fuel for the furnace. All his colossal, inhuman energy was directed toward one singular purpose: the work. He was alone. He never married. He fathered no children. His complex, surly nature built a fortress around him that few dared to breach. His only profound connection in these twilight years was a spiritual, platonic love for Vittoria Colonna, a poetess of immense intellect. With her, he spoke as an equal of God, art, and the immortality of the soul. Her death was a hammer blow that shattered him, plunging him into a deep melancholy. Yet, he did not stop. Even past the age of 80, weak and nearly blind, he continued to create. At night, by the trembling light of a candle, he attacked the stone one last time. He worked on his final, most tragic sculpture, the Rondanini Pietà. This was not the polished, mirror-smooth perfection of his youth. This was something raw, unfinished, almost abstract. The figures of Christ and his mother merge into a single, elongated mass, ghostly and weightless. It was not a story of divine peace. It was a cry of suffering, of death, and of a desperate hope for salvation. He chiseled at it until days before the end. Michelangelo died on February 18th, 1564, just weeks shy of his 89th birthday. He passed in silence, surrounded by a few faithful disciples. The Pope intended a funeral of imperial grandeur, planning to bury him within St. Peter's Basilica, the very temple he had raised toward the heavens. But Florence, his motherland, had other plans. In a final twist worthy of a thriller, Michelangelo's nephew stole the body in the dead of night. He hid the corpse in a bale of merchandise, smuggling it out of Rome like contraband. Florence received her prodigal son like a king. The city staged a funeral of royal magnitude. He was laid to rest in the Basilica of Santa Croce, amidst the pantheon of Italian giants, alongside Galileo and Machiavelli. What then is his legacy? It is total. It is everywhere. He shattered the medieval conception of the artist.
Before him, an artist was a craftsman. After him, an artist was a creator, a genius equal to God in his power to forge new worlds. He left behind symbols that define human civilization. David, the eternal avatar of liberty, the Sistine ceiling, the greatest epic ever painted, the dome of St. Peter's, the crown of the eternal city. But perhaps his truest legacy lies not in stone or paint, but in his own image, the image of the Titan, eternally unsatisfied, rebellious, and solitary. His life was one long, agonizing battle, a battle against rebellious marble, against ignorant patrons, against envious rivals, and above all, a battle against himself, against his own superhuman standards which he felt he never truly reached. For him, genius was not a gift, but a curse, a source of eternal suffering and a sweet condemnation. Today, when we stand before his powerful figures, we see more than divine beauty. We see the reflection of his own soul, tragic, rebellious, and absolutely grand. It is the soul of a man who challenged men, gods, and the stone itself. And in that desperate, lonely struggle, he found immortality.